Hi everyone, welcome back to 2 Cells, 1 Pack.
Today we're going to do a tire change on the T4 as per Chris' request, but look in the middle of the clip and there will be a little bit of a bonus for you.
Alright, let's start.
These are the tools you'll need to do a tire change: a 3, 4, and 5 millimeter hex, a Phillips PH2 screwdriver, the tire valve core remover, as well as the tire spoons. So first things first, we need to remove the pedal in order to access these two bolts. Now to release the pedal, we're going to remove this, the two grub screws and the rod. However, there is a tensioning screw here. Now be careful with this one. You want to loosen it, but do not take it out because it's very easy to cross thread when you're putting it back in. Now, similar to the EX30, you'll need your 4 millimeter hex screwdriver bit in order to remove the 4 bolts that hold up the battery, 2 at the bottom, 2 at the top. In order to release the motor phase cut wires, we'll need to remove these 3 clamps with these 4 Phillips PH2 heads. When all the clamps are removed and your battery box is loose, you can pull your battery box a little bit out of the way and slide your motor cable out of the channel in order to access the last motor bolt on the axle down here. The motor is held in by 4 5 millimeter hex bolts on each side, so 8 in total. Once the motor axle bolts are out, what I like to do is pull the motor cable out through the side and then lightly screw the battery pack in so it doesn't flop around. Now, when you're doing the motor axle bolts, if you notice that there is a gap here, what you'll want to do is compress that suspension all the way up by either clamping on the table or pushing into the ground. That will lift the motor axle bolts higher up, which will give you better access so you're not trying to unscrew at an angle. When all the 4 bolts are removed, this clamp will come out, and this is the spacer between the axle and the pillars. So just make sure you hold on to this. So what we're going to do now is if you have another table, you want to put it beside so that you can slide the body out and rotate it. And then put it on its side. Now this will allow you to do your tire change. Freely beside the wheel without having to remove the motor cables. So for those that watch our tire change videos regularly, you'll know that most of the time at this point, we're going to reverse and reassemble everything. However, I've got a bonus for you. We have this apart mainly for the reason of greasing the bearings properly, as well as adding a waterproof cover, as the Begode wheels prior to the EX30 don't have bearing seals and the bearings can rust very easily. So I have recorded this. If you're looking for just a tire change, skip on to the next chapter. But if you want to look at the process of greasing the bearings, packing it with grease, and adding the covers, follow along right now and I'll show you what we do. So these are the tools you will need in order to not only pack the bearing with more grease to prevent water ingress, but also to add this 3D printed bearing seal to prevent any future water from getting in. Now, these 3D printed seals are got from Thingiverse, so I will post the link in the description below. You'll also need some good grease, a pick tool in order to peel the seal off the stock OEM bearing, E6000 to glue this to the motor cover, and this grease vent, which is also printed off Thingiverse. So these two things you'll have to source on your own. This is printed from a TPU, and this is printed from a hard PLA. So in order to pack the grease of the bearings on both sides of the motor, you'll actually need to release the motor cable from the control board. So you'll need a 3 millimeter hex screwdriver bit for the 4 screws that are on the seat. The next step is to remove the motherboard cover, which is held on by 4 3mm hex screws. Now, in order for some safety, since you are removing the motor phase wires, you'll want to unplug the control board from the battery charge board so there's no more power, and then drain the capacitors of stored energy. Now we will press the power switch just to drain the capacitors. It looks like the wheel is never turned on and therefore there's no stored energy. You may see your light flash on and then it'll turn off pretty soon after. These 4 3mm hex screws hold on the display board, and therefore when I remove it, it'll expose the motor phase wires. Now when you remove it, you will have these copper spacers, so just make sure you hold on to those and keep those secure. Now, if you have a version 1 T4, you will notice that this motherboard is different. This is the new upgraded motherboard for the T4 version 2 and beyond. It has more capacitors and more MOSFETs. Now, the phase wires are actually held on with a clamp. So in order to access the screw, we need to release the headlight. Now, if you're familiar with the version 1 T4, it used to have a rubber gasket around the cover. They did remove that, which is a really good step actually, because it's much easier now to release these cables. And now each cable has their own independent O-ring for water tightness. So when you're about to remove the phase wires from any control board, some control board these days will say on the board what the color of the phase wires are. But it is always a good practice to peel it back before you take it apart. So you see this one is yellow, you'll see this one is blue, and this last one will be green, which is kind of hard to see. It's always good to take a picture of it so that when you do put things back together, you are plugging the correct phases to the right posts. Now in this scenario, because the headlight is all zip tied and wire managed here by Begode, good job to Begode on that one. We're going to unplug the headlights, the buzzer, as well as the hall sensor, and then the 3 posts for the phase wires. Once you've released all the cables from the board, you can now just lift up the O-ring from the slots and you're good to go. So before we put the bearing seal on top, what we need to do is actually remove this the plastic rubber cover here in order to expose the ball bearings so that we can pack more grease into it. So sometimes it'd be kind of difficult to kind of get it out, but you'll want to be very careful as to not destroy the ring. As you can see, there isn't very much grease in there. So we're going to pack a little bit fuller, put the cover back on, and then put the seal in. Now, as you can see, we've added a bit of marine grease in there. Now we're going to put the cover back on. So 2 things before you put the 3D printed seal on top. Firstly, I like to take some excess grease and just rub it around the axle here. And then secondly, before I glue down the cover, I will want to clean off this edge because that is where we'll be gluing it. So now what we'll do is I'm going to apply some E6000 adhesive to the edge here so that I can sit along this motor cover and seal the gap. Now before I put this down, I'll want to add a little bit more grease to the edge here. So you're pushing down to make it flush, and then you want to push down the edges and squeeze out the glue a little bit in hopes to get a better seal. So at this point, before you plug in your phase wires, again, double check your colors of the phases. If you screw this up, your wheel will go crazy like a bat out of hell. So double, triple check, whatever you need to do. Just make sure you plug the same ones into the same places. With the T4, it's a little bit easier because there's actually 3 different lengths. So the longest one is the furthest one from the grommet. So with these cables, if you forget, just remember that Begode has color-coded everything. So their pale yellow will always go with yellow, white with white, and then there's a different size. There's the 5-pin for the hall sensor, which goes in there as well. With these type of plugs, you will notice that there is this locking mechanism. Now just make sure that the locking mechanism faces the corresponding side of the plug, which you will see a gapped section for. Now when screwing the motherboard as well as the display back in, you'll need your long screws as well as the copper bushings. Now these stanchions are a little bit hard to put in because they don't really secure to anything. So just be very careful as you kind of put things together. Also in this corner here, you have the phase wires from this connector that go behind. Now there's a screw back there, just make sure you don't pinch anything as you're screwing it back in. Now when you plug back in the control board to the batteries, it may spark when filling up the capacitors. Do not be alarmed. Now we're going to put the motor back into the shell. When you have the batteries and the frame sitting like this, before you slide it in, I would suggest to remove these two battery screws, put the battery aside so that you can play with the cable without damaging anything. So what I like to do is to look through the holes to line everything up, and then don't forget your spacer. The cutout of the spacer will match where the cutout for the motor cable is, and the flat side will match the flat side. Once you've done that, take your 5mm bolts and thread them in by hand. Now that the 4 bolts are threaded in, we are going to leave them loose for now. Bolt back the battery pack so that we can flip over the whole wheel. If you look down the holes, you can see that the motor has some wiggle. You'll want to line up those holes and then just slide the C-ring in. Now, if you do experience difficulties, you can remove the battery pack to help you put the C-ring in, but I am lazy, therefore I don't do that. What I like to do is focus on one hole so that you can put one of the screws in, and once you do that, it will rotate around that one screw so it's easier to line up the other 3. Once you've threaded all 8 bolts onto the axle, you can now tighten every bolt down. Okay, so that brings us to the end of the tire change video. Now, Hopefully you learned something new and different in this video, but that is it.
If this video is useful for you, you may give us a like and subscribe. And you can also turn on ding dong to receive notification of our latest content. We'll see you in our next video. Bye!